California. Inside Lockheed's experimental hangar, engineers gathered around a shape that looked more insect than airplane. Twin booms of polished metal, engines out on the wings, a central pod just large enough for one man and 4 machine guns. The designation read XP-38. The concept came from a 29-year-old engineer named Clarence Johnson, a man who designed as if bureaucracy did not exist. His machine broke every convention the Army Air Corps trusted. 2 engines instead of 1, a tricycle landing gear, turbo superchargers mounted in the tail, no gun synchronization, no precedent. The Air Corps had asked for a high-altitude interceptor. Johnson gave them something else, an aircraft that could fly 400 miles per hour at 20,000 feet, climb like a rocket, and carry firepower twice that of any fighter in the world. It looked dangerous because it was. The generals called it a technician's fantasy. In February 1939, the prototype took off from March Field under the hands of Lieutenant Benjamin Kelsey. He climbed through thin winter air over California desert, watching the airspeed needle rise past 420. It was the fastest any American fighter had ever flown. The Army publicized the event cautiously. The public heard about a new pursuit plane that could cross the continent. Within Lockheed, Johnson's team celebrated quietly. The prototype still belonged to theory. The War Department remained skeptical. Internal memoranda, later archived in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, described the design as too complex for field maintenance and economically inefficient for tactical deployment. Twin-engine pursuit planes were considered unnecessary. Fighters, by doctrine, were supposed to be single-seat, single-engine, short-range interceptors. Range belonged to bombers, complexity to factories, not pilots. Then came the crash. On February 11, 1939, Kelsey attempted a transcontinental speed record from California to New York. The XP-38 reached the East Coast in 7 hours and 2 minutes, an extraordinary time. But during approach to Mitchell Field, carburetor icing robbed both engines of power. The prototype glided helplessly into the golf course short of the runway, shattered but intact enough for photographs. The Army called it proof that the design was unreliable. Lockheed called it proof that it had already made history. The official report focused on maintenance burden. 2 engines meant twice the failure rate, twice the logistics, twice the training. Wartime production planners argued that such complexity would cripple mobilization. The cost per unit, over $120,000, more than double the price of a P-40, reinforced their argument. In a pre-war economy still counting dollars per airframe, innovation looked like waste. Yet Johnson and his engineers refused to stand down. They rewired the systems, adjusted intercoolers, and recalibrated turbos to prevent future icing. The technical team created a new aerodynamic model, tested it in Lockheed's wind tunnel, and concluded that nothing else in existence could match its climb rate or range. Johnson wrote in a memo later preserved in the Lockheed corporate archives, "The P-38 concept violates doctrine only because doctrine has not caught up." In September 1939, war began in Europe. American procurement quickened, but the lightning still lingered on the margins. Only 13 YP-38 service test models were ordered, barely enough for a single squadron. Production crews built them by hand, each slightly different from the last. The aircraft were assigned to the first pursuit group for evaluation. Pilots marveled at its acceleration and armament. 4.50 caliber machine guns and one 20mm cannon, all concentrated in the nose, capable of delivering a pound of lead per second without convergence loss. But they also cursed its quirks: heavy controls at high speed, unreliable engines, unfamiliar systems. Across the Atlantic, Britain sought American aircraft under emergency contracts. The Royal Air Force, desperate for fighters, ordered 143 Lightning IS, export versions stripped of turbo superchargers due to US restrictions on classified equipment. The aircraft arrived in 1941. British pilots tested them over cold, damp airfields and found the engines temperamental. Without turbos, the planes underperformed, barely reaching 350 miles per hour. RAF evaluators dismissed them as unsuitable for combat service. The order was cancelled after 3 months. The rejection stung. Within Lockheed, engineers circulated the RAF report underlined in red. The company had built the fastest, most advanced fighter in the world, only to watch it fail because the Allies misunderstood its design. Yet production lines were already moving. The United States Army, though ambivalent, could not ignore the industrial reality. The P-38 existed, and it worked, at least on paper. Burbank transformed. By mid-1941, the Lockheed plant expanded to 1.5 million square feet. Hundreds of subcontractors supplied aluminum forgings, plexiglass canopies, and electrical harnesses. The design that generals had doubted was being tooled into mass production before doctrine caught up. In a war economy, rejection could not stop momentum. Inside the Army Air Force's Materiel Division, officers debated whether to continue funding. Memoranda from Wright Field repeated the same phrase. A fighter for which there is presently no tactical role. Yet orders continued, driven by production inertia and political pressure to sustain California's aircraft workforce. In effect, the P-38 survived by accident, an industrial organism too large to cancel. Johnson's engineers refined the design under cover of bureaucracy. They added self-sealing fuel tanks, armor plating, and revised cooling systems. Each change increased weight, but the aircraft still outclimbed every American fighter in service. Test flights recorded speeds over 420 miles per hour at altitude, unmatched by anything short of a German prototype. By late 1941, the first operational P-38s entered squadron service. Pilots at March Field trained for high-altitude interception that never came. When Japanese aircraft attacked Pearl Harbor that December, most Lightnings still waited stateside, their potential unrealized. Commanders reassigned them to coastal defense patrols, long-range escort over the Pacific approaches where no enemy appeared. The aircraft remained an anomaly. Twin engines on a single pilot, range beyond mission plans, speed without strategy. But its very existence represented something new in American aviation. It was not built because doctrine demanded it. It was built because industry could. The rejection that defined its early years became the foundation of its future. Every criticism, too heavy, too complicated, too expensive, would later become advantage. Complexity meant survivability. One engine lost did not mean death. Weight meant range. Range meant reach. Cost meant quality control at scale. In Lockheed's internal production bulletin of November 1941, a single line summarized the company's stance. The Lightning is not a fighter designed for war as it is, but for war as it will be. No one in the War Department yet understood how prophetic that sentence was. Within 2 years, the same machine dismissed as impractical would strike an enemy admiral 1,000 miles from base, altering the geometry of the Pacific War. But in 1939, it remained an experiment, aluminum, ambition, and a handful of men who believed that rejection was merely the first test of an idea's endurance. The P-38 Lightning was born unwanted, doubted, and nearly abandoned. Yet its very rejection ensured its survival. Only a nation capable of mass-producing what it did not yet understand could one day wield such a machine as its most feared weapon. In the end, America's gamble was not in building a twin-engine fighter. The gamble was believing that progress could outrun approval, and that industry could teach doctrine what the future looked like. The Lightning waited in hangars across California, gleaming silver under floodlights, a rejected experiment ready for the world that would soon need it. Pearl Harbor's smoke had barely cleared when the Army Air Forces faced a new geography of war. Oceans instead of continents, distances beyond any fighter's reach. The Pacific was measured in thousands of miles, not front lines. Every doctrine the Air Corps had built before December 7th was obsolete by sunrise on December 8th. In Washington, planners realized their fighter force could not escort bombers, intercept raiders, or strike back across the Pacific's vastness. The P-40S and P-39S that filled the squadrons of the U.S. Army Air Forces had range for barely 400 miles. Japanese Zeros flew farther and fought longer. The nation that had built the world's largest industrial base found itself outflown. Then, buried in the Air Materiel Commands files, engineers rediscovered the twin-engine anomaly that had once been rejected. The P-38 Lightning's specifications, 410 miles per hour top speed, 1,500-mile range with drop tanks, suddenly defined not excess but necessity. In February 1942, the first Lightnings reached Australia under 13th Fighter Command. They were assigned to defend the ferry routes between New Guinea and the Coral Sea. Pilots arriving from California found themselves staring across water that stretched beyond vision. They nicknamed the plane the Flying Forktail Devil, a description borrowed later by their Japanese enemies. Operational testing began under Colonel George C. Kenney, commander of the newly formed 5th Air Force. Kenney's first impression, recorded in his 1943 combat report, was pragmatic. The Lightning is the only aircraft in our inventory capable of escorting bombers or reaching enemy bases in range of meaningful effect doctrine had bent to geography. The Lightning's twin Allison V-1710 engines gave redundancy over open ocean. The tricycle landing gear allowed safer takeoffs from coral runways. Its armament, 4.50 caliber machine guns and a 20mm cannon, concentrated in the nose, delivered killing power at long range. Yet the plane remained temperamental. It overheated easily in tropical climates, and early models lacked cockpit cooling. Pilots fought not just the Japanese, but the machine itself. Lieutenant Richard Bong, a farm boy from Wisconsin, described his first combat patrol over Leh. "We climbed through clouds that looked like mountain ranges. The fuel gauges dropped fast. You could feel the ocean under you all the time." He would later become America's top ace, all in P-38s. The first major test came in August 1942. 2 Lightnings from the 39th Fighter Squadron intercepted a Japanese reconnaissance bomber 430 miles north of Port Moresby, the first enemy aircraft destroyed by a P-38 in the Pacific. The engagement revealed the aircraft's strategic value. For the first time, American fighters had extended the reach of the war. By late 1942, the P-38 became the only fighter capable of covering Allied bombers during attacks on Rabaul, the heavily defended Japanese fortress base. The distance from Port Moresby to Rabaul was 600 miles one way. P-40S could not make it. P-38s could, barely. Crews attached external fuel tanks, improvised from 165-gallon drums welded in field shops. Takeoffs were heavy and landings came with tanks empty to fumes. Enemy reports began to register the new presence. Captured Japanese documents from the 4th Air Group War Diary, later translated by the Allied Translator and Interpreter section, noted, "The 2-engined enemy fighter is extremely fast and climbs at a rate impossible for our pilots to match. Attack from below and behind only." In Tokyo, analysts of the Imperial Japanese Navy Aviation Bureau studied intelligence reports describing an American fighter with twin tails and high-altitude performance. They dismissed it as impractical for mass production. By 1943, it was already being built faster than any aircraft Japan could field. The Lightning's effectiveness forced a new operational concept: long-range fighter sweeps designed not for air superiority alone, but to destroy the enemy's ability to move. In November 1942, 13th Fighter Command used Lightnings to intercept supply convoys to New Guinea. Radar-directed missions extended over 800 miles, with average flight times exceeding 6 hours. The endurance that once seemed excessive became tactical advantage. Pilots adapted tactics around the aircraft's strengths. Boom and zoom, high-speed dives followed by vertical climbs, exploited its weight and speed. Unlike the Zero, the Lightning could dive without structural failure. Unlike single-engine fighters, it could survive a hit and still fly home. In one report, Lieutenant Robert Petit recorded flying 400 miles with a dead engine, landing safely on the other. The Pacific Theatre became the crucible for the Lightning's evolution. Engineers at Lockheed received combat feedback weekly through coded cables. Field modifications turned into design revisions. Turbocharger problems led to new intercoolers. The canopy was redesigned for tropical heat. Propeller synchronization issues were corrected through dual-frequency governors. By late 1943, the P-38J model emerged, faster, cooler, more reliable. Industrial persistence again outpaced doctrine. While other aircraft were built to fit immediate tactics, the Lightning was continuously adapted to shape strategy. In a war defined by logistics and geography, range became the currency of victory. The P-38 turned range into reach, reach into dominance. The aircraft that generals had once called too complicated became the cornerstone of a new kind of aerial warfare, one measured not by territory gained, but by the radius of possible action. By December 1942, the Lightning operated from Guadalcanal to the Bismarck Sea. It escorted bombers, struck shipping, and scouted enemy airfields. For every mission, pilots carried maps with concentric fuel rings drawn around each base, a visual reminder of the limits they alone could push. In the Pacific, rejection became doctrine. The same traits that had once doomed the aircraft, cost, complexity, range, defined its indispensability. What the Army had doubted in 1939 became its only bridge across an oceanic war. When Lockheed engineers reviewed production statistics that winter, more than 1,200 units delivered, they understood that the Lightning had crossed from experiment to instrument. Kelly Johnson later recalled in an interview, "They said 2 engines made it too complex. The Pacific proved 1 engine wasn't enough." By early 1943, as P-38 squadrons began planning the most ambitious intercept in aviation history, the aircraft had already rewritten American air power's logic. It was no longer a prototype seeking approval, but a weapon built for the impossible geography of the Pacific, a machine that made distance an ally rather than an obstacle. Rejection had turned into revelation. The twin-engine gamble had paid off in the only currency that mattered in war: reach. The Pacific had no roads, no front lines, no limits, except those defined by fuel. The Lightning, once unwanted, became the bridge across the ocean. April 18, 1943. Bougainville, Solomon Islands. At dawn, 18 P-38. Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron lifted off from Guadalcanal. Each carried drop tanks, full ammunition, and an order so secret it had been typed on onion skin paper and burned after briefing. Their target was not a base, nor a ship, but a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of Pearl Harbor. The mission was called Operation Vengeance. Intelligence had come from a decrypted Japanese message intercepted by U.S. Navy codebreakers at Station Hypo. It listed Yamamoto's itinerary: a morning flight from Rabaul to Balale Airfield for an inspection tour, precise times, routes, and altitudes. The challenge was distance. Yamamoto's flight path lay 435 miles from Guadalcanal, beyond the range of any standard fighter. Only the P-38 Lightning could reach it, fight, and return. The plan's architects, Admiral William F. Halsey's staff and 13th Fighter Command, calculated the intercept geometry with slide rules and grease pencils. The Lightnings would fly 400 miles over open sea, maintaining radio silence at wave-top altitude to evade radar. They would arrive over Bougainville at 9:34 local time, the exact moment Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers crossed the coast. It was a mission defined by mathematics and faith. One engine failure, one navigational error, and the formation would vanish into the Pacific. But the pilots volunteered without hesitation. Major John W. Mitchell led the flight. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber would execute the intercept. The P-38's twin engines roared across the Solomon Sea. Sunlight flickered on the water. At 10 a.m., radar contact was impossible. The mission relied on dead reckoning alone. Mitchell's navigators had plotted every leg to the second. When the formation reached the coast of Bougainville, the clock read 9:34. Ahead, 2 Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zeros appeared, exactly on time. The Lightning's long nose and concentrated firepower turned seconds into history. Lanphier climbed to intercept from the right. Barber swung wide and cut across the formation's path. Yamamoto's bomber banked left, descending toward the jungle canopy. Barber fired a burst from 300 yards, tracers stitched across the fuselage. Smoke erupted. The bomber rolled inverted and plunged into the forest. Seconds later, the second bomber went down under Lanphier's fire. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The Lightnings turned for home, climbing above the clouds to avoid Zero pursuit. They had been in enemy airspace for barely 10 minutes. By 11:45, they were back over the ocean, fuel gauges near empty. Mitchell's flight landed at Henderson Field at 1300, engines sputtering dry. Within hours, Japanese search parties reached the crash site near Buin. Admiral Yamamoto's body was found among the wreckage, still seated upright, hand on his sword. His watch had stopped at 9:35. Japanese war records later described national shock bordering on disbelief. For the first time, the enemy understood that American intelligence could reach anywhere, and that range had become a weapon. At Guadalcanal, the pilots filed their combat reports. 13th Fighter Command confirmed 2 kills, both Betty bombers destroyed. The debriefing, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, reads with clinical precision. Enemy aircraft engaged at 9:34, altitude 6,000 feet. Lead aircraft identified as Betty Type 1, bearing tail code T1-323. Primary objective destroyed. Washington classified the operation immediately. News of Yamamoto's death was withheld for weeks, both to protect code-breaking sources and to confirm success through Japanese radio silence. When Tokyo finally announced the loss, the impact reverberated across the Pacific. The architect of Pearl Harbor had been hunted, located, and killed in mid-air. Every element of the operation depended on the P-38's attributes once deemed flaws. 2 engines gave reliability across 800 miles of ocean. Long range allowed a strike impossible for any other fighter. Concentrated nose armament delivered lethal accuracy in seconds. Complexity had become capability. Lockheed's engineers in Burbank received the news through official dispatch channels. In his personal log, Kelly Johnson wrote only one sentence: "The airplane has done what it was built to do." The U.S. National Archives Operation Vengeance records later detailed the technical planning. Each Lightning carried 2 330-gallon drop tanks, extending range to 1,000 miles. Propeller pitch was fixed to conserve fuel. Formation altitude remained below 50 feet for the first 400 miles to minimize radar detection. Even the turn toward Bougainville had been timed to the second, an intercept designed as a mathematical proof. The mission also revealed a deeper shift in American warfare. Intelligence, industry, and logistics had merged into a single act. Decoding, production, and precision flying converged within hours. No single branch of the military could have executed the mission alone. Japanese post-war interrogations confirmed the psychological shock. Officers from the 11th Air Fleet testified that Yamamoto's death severely damaged morale throughout all naval air units. The loss of their most respected strategist coincided with increasing Allied air superiority and fuel shortages. The psychological equation of the war began to reverse. Within U.S. Fighter Command, Operation Vengeance became a case study in integrated warfare. 13th Fighter Command's after-action analysis concluded, the decisive element was not aircraft quantity, but aircraft range, combined with intelligence precision. The P-38's reputation transformed overnight. What had begun as a controversial twin-engine experiment now symbolized the reach of American industry and resolve. In the months that followed, Lightning squadrons expanded across the Pacific, New Guinea, the Marshalls, the Marianas. The same aircraft that had once been rejected by the British and doubted by its own generals had now executed the most precise aerial assassination in history. Major Mitchell's squadron received the Navy Cross. The mission remained classified for decades, its details reconstructed only through declassified records and pilot interviews. Historians later debated which pilot fired the fatal burst, Lanphier or Barber. But the larger truth stood beyond dispute. The weapon itself had made the mission possible. In the National World War II Museum's exhibit Operation Vengeance, a single quote from General George Kenney is displayed beside a P-38's propeller blade. The airplane that could fly farther than common sense allowed became the instrument of inevitability. Operation Vengeance was more than retribution. It was demonstration. The Lightning's range and precision announced a new kind of war, one defined by reach, not proximity. The Pacific was no longer an oceanic barrier. It was a coordinate system. When Kelly Johnson visited Lockheed's assembly line later that year, he stopped before a row of newly finished P-38s, their aluminum skin reflecting the light through factory skylights. "They told me it was too complex," he said to a reporter. "Maybe it is." But sometimes complexity is just another word for capability. The mission over Bougainville proved him right. The P-38 Lightning, once rejected as impractical, had carried vengeance across an ocean and rewritten the geography of war. April 18, 1943. Bougainville, Solomon Islands. At dawn, 18 P-38. Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron lifted off from Guadalcanal. Each carried drop tanks, full ammunition, and an order so secret it had been typed on onion skin paper and burned after briefing. Their target was not a base, nor a ship, but a man, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of Pearl Harbor. The mission was called Operation Vengeance. Intelligence had come from a decrypted Japanese message intercepted by U.S. Navy codebreakers at Station Hypo. It listed Yamamoto's itinerary: a morning flight from Rabaul to Balele Airfield for an inspection tour, precise times, routes, and altitudes. The challenge was distance. Yamamoto's flight path lay 435 miles from Guadalcanal, beyond the range of any standard fighter. Only the P-38 Lightning could reach it, fight, and return. The plan's architects, Admiral William F. Halsey's staff and 13th Fighter Command, calculated the intercept geometry with slide rules and grease pencils. The Lightnings would fly 400 miles over open sea, maintaining radio silence at wave-top altitude to evade radar. They would arrive over Bougainville at 9:34 local time, the exact moment Yamamoto's Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers crossed the coast. It was a mission defined by mathematics and faith. One engine failure, one navigational error, and the formation would vanish into the Pacific. But the pilots volunteered without hesitation. Major John W. Mitchell led the flight. Captain Thomas Lanphier and Lieutenant Rex Barber would execute the intercept. The P-38's twin engines roared across the Solomon Sea. Sunlight flickered on the water. At 10 a.m., radar contact was impossible. The mission relied on dead reckoning alone. Mitchell's navigators had plotted every leg to the second. When the formation reached the coast of Bougainville, the clock read 9:34. Ahead, 2 Betty bombers escorted by 6 Zeros appeared, exactly on time. The Lightning's long nose and concentrated firepower turned seconds into history. Lanfear climbed to intercept from the right. Barber swung wide and cut across the formation's path. Yamamoto's bomber banked left, descending toward the jungle canopy. Barber fired a burst from 300 yards, tracers stitched across the fuselage. Smoke erupted. The bomber rolled inverted and plunged into the forest. Seconds later, the second bomber went down under Lanfear's fire. The entire engagement lasted less than 4 minutes. The Lightnings turned for home, climbing above the clouds to avoid Zero pursuit. They had been in enemy airspace for barely 10 minutes. By 11:45, they were back over the ocean, fuel gauges near empty. Mitchell's flight landed at Henderson Field at 1300, engines sputtering dry. Within hours, Japanese search parties reached the crash site near Buin. Admiral Yamamoto's body was found among the wreckage, still seated upright, hand on his sword. His watch had stopped at 9:35. Japanese war records later described national shock bordering on disbelief. For the first time, the enemy understood that American intelligence could reach anywhere, and that range had become a weapon. At Guadalcanal, the pilots filed their combat reports. 13th Fighter Command confirmed 2 kills, both Betty bombers destroyed. The debriefing, preserved in the Air Force Historical Research Agency, reads with clinical precision. Enemy aircraft engaged at 9:34, altitude 6,000 feet. Lead aircraft identified as Betty Type 1, bearing tail code T1-323. Primary objective destroyed. Washington classified the operation immediately. News of Yamamoto's death was withheld for weeks, both to protect code-breaking sources and to confirm success through Japanese radio silence. When Tokyo finally announced the loss, the impact reverberated across the Pacific. The architect of Pearl Harbor had been hunted, located, and killed in mid-air. Every element of the operation depended on the P-38's attributes once deemed flaws. 2 engines gave reliability across 800 miles of ocean. Long range allowed a strike impossible for any other fighter. Concentrated nose armament delivered lethal accuracy in seconds. Complexity had become capability. Lockheed's engineers in Burbank received the news through official dispatch channels. In his personal log, Kelly Johnson wrote only one sentence: "The airplane has done what it was built to do." The U.S. National Archives Operation Vengeance records later detailed the technical planning. Each Lightning carried 2 330-gallon drop tanks, extending range to 1,000 miles. Propeller pitch was fixed to conserve fuel. Formation altitude remained below 50 feet for the first 400 miles to minimize radar detection. Even the turn toward Bougainville had been timed to the second, an intercept designed as a mathematical proof. The mission also revealed a deeper shift in American warfare. Intelligence, industry, and logistics had merged into a single act. Decoding, production, and precision flying converged within hours. No single branch of the military could have executed the mission alone. Japanese post-war interrogations confirmed the psychological shock. Officers from the 11th Air Fleet testified that Yamamoto's death severely damaged morale throughout all naval air units. The loss of their most respected strategist coincided with increasing Allied air superiority and fuel shortages. The psychological equation of the war began to reverse. Within U.S. Fighter Command, Operation Vengeance became a case study in integrated warfare. 13th Fighter Command's after-action analysis concluded, "The decisive element was not aircraft quantity, but aircraft range, combined with intelligence precision." The P-38's reputation transformed overnight. What had begun as a controversial twin-engine experiment now symbolized the reach of American industry and resolve. In the months that followed, Lightning squadrons expanded across the Pacific, New Guinea, the Marshalls, the Marianas. The same aircraft that had once been rejected by the British and doubted by its own generals had now executed the most precise aerial assassination in history. Major Mitchell's squadron received the Navy Cross. The mission remained classified for decades, its details reconstructed only through declassified records and pilot interviews. Historians later debated which pilot fired the fatal burst, Lanphier or Barber, but the larger truth stood beyond dispute. The weapon itself had made the mission possible. In the National World War II Museum's exhibit Operation Vengeance, a single quote from General George Kenney is displayed beside a P-38's propeller blade. The airplane that could fly farther than common sense allowed became the instrument of inevitability. Operation Vengeance was more than retribution, it was demonstration. The Lightning's range and precision announced a new kind of war, one defined by reach, not proximity. The Pacific was no longer an oceanic barrier. It was a coordinate system. When Kelly Johnson visited Lockheed's assembly line later that year, he stopped before a row of newly finished P-38s, their aluminum skin reflecting the light through factory skylights. "They told me it was too complex," he said to a reporter. "Maybe it is." But sometimes complexity is just another word for capability. The mission over Bougainville proved him right. The P-38 Lightning, once rejected as impractical, had carried vengeance across an ocean and rewritten the geography of war. 1943 to 1944. The Pacific War had turned, though few yet understood how completely. The Japanese still held the Central Ocean, but their fuel lines were bleeding out, and the sky above it had changed shape. The P-38 Lightning, once an experimental deviation, was no longer a tool used in the war. It had become the tool that defined it. At 5th and 13th Fighter Commands, range was no longer a statistic, it was strategy. Every new base seized by island invasion was measured by what it extended the P-38's reach toward. On the maps pinned in operations huts, the circles of Lightning coverage overlapped like ripples, Solomons to New Guinea to the Marshalls, Marshalls to the Marianas. The ocean itself had become an airfield. By mid-1943, Lockheed's Burbank factory was producing 70 Lightnings a month. Each airframe represented 200,000 rivets and 8,000 man-hours of labor. The Army Air Force's Materiel Division reported that the P-38 required 50% more assembly time than the P-47 Thunderbolt, but its combat record justified every hour. Over the Bismarck Sea, Lightning squadrons had destroyed nearly half of Japan's transport fleet in a single engagement. In each case, range decided outcome. Bombers that once needed fighter escort now were the escort. The air war's logic shifted accordingly. Kenney's staff coined a new term, penetration escort. Missions once impossible for single-engine fighters became routine. P-38S flew with B-24S over Wewak and Rabaul, then turned on their own to sweep airfields 200 miles beyond the bomb line. The Lightning's twin engines allowed pilots to take risks unthinkable before. As one after-action report from the 475th Fighter Group put it, "When one engine quits, you go home. When both quit, you swim." Japanese diaries from captured bases described the new imbalance. Pilots of the 4th Air Group wrote in September 1943, "The twin-tail enemy appears everywhere. He climbs like a demon and dives faster than our airspeed limit. Morale declines." In truth, the Lightning's presence had become psychological artillery. Its silhouette, twin booms and central nacelle meant inevitability. From an industrial standpoint, the aircraft was a paradox, too expensive to discard, too capable to replace. Each successive model incorporated lessons written in combat. The P-38J added redesigned engine cowlings and improved cooling, solving the tropical overheating that had haunted earlier versions. The P-38L introduced hydraulic boost for ailerons, letting pilots roll faster at high speed. Nothing was static. Every flaw was treated as unfinished potential. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works team developed modifications faster than the bureaucracy could approve them. Mechanics in forward areas field-installed drop tanks, camera pods, even radar sets. The Lightning became fighter, interceptor, escort and reconnaissance platform in one. By 1944, reconnaissance variants, designated F4 and F5, were mapping entire island chains before invasions. Their long, narrow fuselages carried cameras instead of cannon. Their photos planned amphibious landings months ahead. To the pilots, the aircraft was no longer an experiment. It was a partner with personality. They learned to manage its temperament, high torque on takeoff, tight fuel balancing, delicate flap settings on approach. "The Lightning will forgive you anything but inattention," one instructor told new arrivals. And still, they trusted it more than any other machine. From the Japanese perspective, the transformation looked like a natural disaster. Reports from the combined fleet's surviving air officers described the impossibility of matching range. Even Japan's best new fighter, the Ki-84 Frank, could barely reach 1,200 miles with external tanks, half the Lightning's operational radius. Worse, Japan's aviation fuel had dropped in octane and quantity. Superchargers failed, engines ran hot. American factories had achieved what strategy alone could not: endurance. Back home, Lockheed's production had become a model of wartime efficiency. Women on assembly lines riveted wing spars and booms under signs reading "The Fork-tailed Devil Works Here." Between 1940 and 1945, 9,923 Lightnings rolled off the lines. Each represented the convergence of skepticism turned to faith. What began as one prototype smashed in a golf course now filled hangars across two oceans. Doctrine finally caught up. The Army Air Forces published Tactical Memorandum No. 15 in early 1944, officially designating the P-38 as the long-range escort fighter of choice for Pacific operations. Training manuals cited its dual-engine reliability and sustained combat power at altitudes above 25,000 feet. The same document that once labelled the design unsuitable for combat service now described it as indispensable to theatre operations. The aircraft's performance over Europe confirmed its universality. In the Mediterranean, P-38s escorted bombers to Ploesti, over the Alps to Munich, to Berlin itself. It was the only Allied fighter that could cross the continent and return. Luftwaffe reports referred to it with grudging respect, der Gabelschwanz Teufel, the fork-tailed devil. But nowhere did it matter more than the Pacific. The Lightning's ability to cross 1,500 miles of water without carrier support redefined air power's geography. Bases once considered isolated, Biak, Morotai, Saipan, became launch points for strategic raids. The aircraft's endurance allowed strikes deep into the Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, and eventually Japan itself. Pilots spoke of fatigue and monotony, 7-hour flights over blue nothing, but also of the quiet comfort of knowing that if one engine quit, the other would carry them home. That dual heartbeat became the rhythm of the Pacific Air War. By 1944, even the skeptics in Washington conceded that the Lightning had rewritten doctrine. At the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey's Pacific briefing later, analysts stated, "In theaters defined by distance, no single design has contributed more to operational mobility than the P-38. Kelly Johnson, looking over production statistics that year, remarked, "The design's only flaw was being 20 months early. He meant it literally. The P-38 had been ready for a war that had not yet learned what it needed." When the first P-51 Mustangs arrived in 1944, faster and easier to build, they inherited tactics the Lightning had proven possible. But even then, the P-38 remained the Pacific's essential vector, its reconnaissance eye, its escort arm, its instrument of reach. In war's arithmetic, speed and firepower were measurable. Range was transformative. The Lightning's twin engines gave the United States a global map scaled to its industry. Where other aircraft ended, the P-38 began. By the time American bombers reached Japan's home islands in 1945, the twin-boomed silhouette was familiar even to civilians on the ground. It was no longer an anomaly. It was the horizon itself. The machine had become doctrine. The lesson was written not in manuals, but in the air it conquered, that innovation rejected in peace becomes necessity in war, and that the true engine of victory is not belief, but persistence. The P-38 Lightning had proven both. April 18, 1943. The South Pacific shimmered under morning haze. At Guadalcanal's Fighter II airstrip, 16 P-38 Lightnings stood ready, engines ticking over in the humid dawn. Mechanics moved quickly, final fuel checks, ammunition belts, oxygen valves. It was not a routine mission. Each aircraft carried drop tanks filled to the limit. Each pilot carried sealed orders. Only Major John W. Mitchell, commanding the 339th Fighter Squadron, knew the objective. At 7 o'clock, the briefing began. Intelligence officers from the 13th Fighter Command unrolled a map across an ammunition crate. Thin red lines traced the Solomon Islands chain, Guadalcanal to Bougainville, 430 miles of open ocean. The target, a specific Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bomber, tail number T-1323. Passenger, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, Commander-in-Chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy, architect of Pearl Harbor. The plan's precision bordered on obsession. U.S. Navy cryptanalysts at Station Hypo had broken Japanese naval code JN-25D. A message intercepted on April 13th detailed Yamamoto's inspection flight schedule. Takeoff, route, landing times exact to the minute. The decision reached Admiral Halsey's headquarters within hours. Intercept and kill. The President himself approved the operation, though no record bears his signature. Mathematically, the mission was almost impossible. The P-38 was the only Allied fighter with the range to reach Bougainville, loiter and return. The route demanded fuel economy within 2% margin. At maximum cruise, each Lightning would fly 1,000 miles round trip, most of it over enemy waters. Any mechanical failure meant death by drowning or capture. The plan designated 12 Lightnings for escort and 4 for the kill group. Major Mitchell would lead. Captain Thomas G. Lanphier Jr. and Lieutenant Rex Barber were assigned primary attack positions. At 7:25, throttles advanced and the formation lifted into the haze, heavy with fuel, skimming the sea to avoid radar detection. The flight held 50 feet above the waves for 400 miles. Airspeed, 200 knots. Altitude, suicide low. 2 hours later, as the formation crossed Bougainville's western coast, Mitchell began a shallow climb. Spotters on Balal Island never saw them. At 9:34, right on time, Yamamoto's 2 Bettys and 6 Zero escorts approached from Rabaul at 6,500 feet. The intercept point, south of Empress Augusta Bay, was reached within 1 minute of calculation. Mitchell gave the order, "Let's get 'em." Drop tanks released, throttles forward. The kill section, Lanphier, Barber and Holmes, pulled into a climbing turn. Sunlight flashed on twin booms as they rose through the cloud layer. Barber saw the bombers first. 2 Bettys, level, 2 o'clock high, with zeros above. Combat lasted barely 90 seconds. Lanphier broke left into the escorting fighters. Barber cut across the bomber's flight path. He opened fire at 200 yards. Cannon and machine guns converged. The lead Betty's right engine burst into flame. It rolled inverted, plunged through the jungle canopy, and exploded near the village of Moyla Point. The second bomber tried to evade, diving for the coast, trailing smoke. Lieutenant Besby Holmes and his wingman finished it off. Japanese witnesses later recorded 1 aircraft crashing inland, 1 into the sea. At 9:36, the admiral of the combined fleet was dead. The American formation turned home. No cheers, no radio calls, just silence and fuel gauges descending towards zero. 2 Lightnings failed to return, lost to fuel exhaustion. But the mission's outcome was clear within hours. Intelligence confirmed that Yamamoto's body had been recovered. Post-war Japanese records verified the time of death. 0935, local. Operation Vengeance entered military history not as an act of vengeance, but as a demonstration of industrial precision. Every component of the mission, code-breaking, navigation, aircraft range, pilot training, depended on systems the United States had mastered through scale. The Lightning's twin-engine reliability made the plan conceivable. No other fighter in Allied service could have done it. The U.S. Navy later calculated the operation's fuel tolerance margin at 3%. The 339th's mechanics had modified drop tanks overnight to increase capacity by 10 gallons each. Lockheed engineers at Burbank confirmed that at reduced cruise power, the P-38's Allison engines could maintain 185 knots for 8 hours. In combat, those calculations became reality. For Japan, the loss was both symbolic and strategic. Yamamoto had been more than a commander. He was a national institution, the mind behind Midway and Pearl Harbor. His death fractured morale within the Imperial Navy. Post-war interrogations of surviving staff officers recorded disbelief. It was not possible for Americans to know such detail. We thought the gods had turned against us. American after-action reports avoided triumphalism. 13th Fighter Command debriefing stated simply, "Objective achieved. 1 bomber confirmed destroyed, 1 probable. Escort resistance minimal." Mitchell's report added, "Execution depended on range performance of P-38 aircraft. All units performed within expected parameters." In later years, debate would circle around who fired the fatal burst, Lanphier or Barber. The official U.S. Victory Credit Board split recognition, but to the machine itself, credit was irrelevant. The Lightning had done what it was designed to do, carry men farther than logic allowed and bring them back. At Lockheed, engineers studied the mission logs with the same precision they had built the aircraft. The recorded fuel burn matched theoretical predictions within 5%. For Kelly Johnson's team, this was not heroism, but validation. A rejected prototype had executed the most precise aerial assassination in modern history. Operation Vengeance marked a turning point in military thinking. Warfare had entered the age of coordination. Intelligence, industry, and engineering fused into one system. The P-38 stood at that intersection. It was not the fastest fighter nor the easiest to fly, but it was the first to turn range and reliability into weapons. Japanese accounts confirm the shock. The 4th Air Group's diary entry for April 19th reads, "Enemy long-range fighters now operate anywhere. We must assume they can reach all sectors." In that sentence lay strategic defeat. When the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey compiled its Pacific Report in 1946, it listed Operation Vengeance among demonstrations of operational integration unprecedented in modern war. The Lightning was cited by name, a machine capable of converting intelligence into reach. The mission's legacy extended beyond combat. The data gathered on cruise performance and navigation led to standardized long-range escort procedures for B-24 and B-29 formations. The kill that silenced Japan's most capable strategist also created the manual for how global air power would function. At Guadalcanal, months later, new pilots arrived to take the places of those who had flown the mission. They studied the same aircraft, the same controls, and the same routes. On briefing walls hung a framed quote from Kelly Johnson, sent by telegram after news reached Burbank. "The airplane has done its duty. Now doctrine will follow." Operation Vengeance proved that it already had. By mid-1943, the P-38 Lightning had transformed from experimental outsider to indispensable instrument of Pacific air power. Yet its rise came not through smooth ascension, but relentless adaptation against a learning enemy. Japan, reeling from the death of Admiral Yamamoto, began rebuilding its air command under new directives: disperse, conceal, conserve. The empire understood that it could not match American production, so it would try to exhaust American endurance. For the 339th Fighter Squadron and its sister units, victory did not bring rest. The Lightnings moved northward, leapfrogging through the Solomon Chain, Munda, Bougainville, Green Island. Each advance demanded new runways carved from jungle by sea bees, fuel lines stretched to breaking point, and pilots trained to fly double the endurance of European missions. The Lightning's twin Allison engines, once derided as overcomplicated, became its salvation. On single-engine performance alone, the P-38 could limp home across hundreds of miles of ocean. It was the only Allied fighter whose survival radius extended beyond its combat radius. In Pacific terms, that difference was life. Operational reports from the 13th Fighter Command between June 1943 and February 1944 show a pattern of endurance unmatched by any other Allied type. Average sortie time, 4 hours, 12 minutes. Average distance covered, 650 miles. Engine failure rates, less than 1.3%. Even when fuel shortages grounded entire bomber wings, P-38s continued to operate. By late 1943, the Lightning spearheaded every major offensive west of Guadalcanal. It flew top cover for the new Georgia landings, struck supply barges along the Bismarck Sea, and intercepted Japanese bombers over Rabaul, the once impregnable fortress of the South Pacific. In November, 339th and 81st Fighter Squadrons executed simultaneous sweeps over Simpson Harbor, diving through flak so dense pilots described it as black hail. 5 Lightnings were lost, 15 Japanese aircraft destroyed. The numbers told a deeper story. American logistical chains now flowed uninterrupted from San Francisco to Espiritu Santo. Lockheed shipped 300 new P-38Js that quarter alone. Japan, by contrast, had received fewer than 80 replacement Zeros from mainland factories. The strategic imbalance that had doomed Germany in Europe was repeating itself island by island. Still, the Lightning's pilots discovered that abundance did not guarantee simplicity. The tropical climate was merciless. At Henderson Field, mechanics stripped and relubricated control cables weekly to combat corrosion. Tropical fungus ate into fabric control surfaces. Engine cowls were repainted in aluminum lacquer to reflect heat. Pilots flew bare-chested to endure cockpit temperatures exceeding 130 degrees Fahrenheit. One 13th Fighter Command memo dated January 14, 1944, noted, "Aircraft systems perform within tolerance, but pilot fatigue increases exponentially after 4 hours. Recommend modification of seat cushions and oxygen regulators." Lockheed engineers at Burbank responded within 6 weeks, sending revised seat harnesses, cockpit ventilation vents, and improved oxygen systems. The factory responded to field reports faster than any command chain. It was an early glimpse of what post-war militaries would call feedback logistics, manufacturing as a living organism reacting to combat conditions in real time. Japanese pilots soon learned that the Lightning's silhouette, twin booms, wide wings, gleaming nacelles, meant danger long before radar did. Post-war interrogation of Lieutenant Shigeo Fukuoka, 204th Air Group, recorded, "When we saw twin tails, we avoided combat. It could climb faster and dive away. We could not catch it. The Lightning's power lay not in turning fights, but in altitude and reach. With turbo-supercharged engines, it operated comfortably at 30,000 feet, well above the Zero's optimum ceiling. American pilots exploited this advantage mercilessly. They learned to strike from above, use superior diving speed, then vanish into cloud. In the Pacific's vertical battle space, the P-38 defined a new geometry of war: 3-dimensional, technological, unforgiving. As Allied forces advanced through the Bismarcks, each base captured became an airfield, each airfield another stepping stone. By March 1944, Lightnings from the 475th Fighter Group escorted bombers over Wewak and Hollandia, stretching their operational radius beyond 700 miles. Combat reports recorded kill ratios exceeding 9-1. Yet the P-38's most profound victory came not in combat statistics, but in logistics. The aircraft's performance allowed planners to skip intermediate islands once deemed essential. Every 400-mile range increment meant one less invasion, one less garrison, one less logistical burden. In purely mathematical terms, the Lightning shortened the Pacific War by months. On April 3, 1944, a formation of P-38s from the 431st Squadron shot down 15 Japanese aircraft over Hollandia without loss. Japanese air resistance began collapsing, not for lack of courage but from systemic starvation. The captured war diary of the 4th Air Group noted, "Fuel rations now 40 litres per aircraft per week, training impossible." By contrast, U.S. Army Air Force's supply tables list Pacific Theater deliveries at 1.2 million gallons per day. At Lockheed's Burbank plant, engineers tracked every returning aircraft. The Pacific units radioed maintenance data in coded transmissions. Structural stress charts, engine wear logs, and armament jam reports arrived daily via teletype. Kelly Johnson's Skunk Works division converted field damage reports into production upgrades. Thicker propeller blades, revised turbo inlets, hydraulic boosts for ailerons. Between the XP-38 of 1939 and the J model of 1944, 1,200 technical changes were implemented, 700 of them originating from combat feedback. In the Marianas Campaign, these refinements became decisive. On June 19, 1944, the day that would later be known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, Lightnings flew outer-screen patrols for B-29 assembly operations. They did not engage in the massive carrier battles directly, but their reconnaissance missions mapped airfields, convoys, and weather patterns that made the naval victory possible. The twin-engine fighter, once doubted for being too heavy and too costly, now formed the nervous system of a continental-scale campaign. By the end of 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces logged 160,000 Lightning sorties across the Pacific and Southwest Pacific theaters. Loss rate, 1.3%. Kill credits, 1,800 confirmed. But perhaps more telling was the number 0, the number of missions cancelled for lack of range. When Japan's own pilots spoke at post-war symposiums, their tone carried awe rather than bitterness. Commander Minoru Genda summarized it succinctly in 1962. The P-38 fought everywhere. When it appeared, we knew America had learned the ocean. The Lightning had evolved from a rejected prototype into the architecture of air dominance. It embodied the logic of American industry, iterative, adaptive, indifferent to early doubt. By the time B-29s rose from the Marianas to bomb Tokyo, the Lightning had already mapped the route, measured the winds, and proven the range. It no longer needed to prove its worth. The machine, once rejected for complexity, had become the very definition of operational simplicity. A weapon that simply worked anywhere, for as long as fuel and pilots lasted. Its twin booms, born from skepticism, now marked the boundary of Japan's shrinking empire. By 1945, the Pacific no longer felt vast. The P-38 Lightning had made geography negotiable. From Saipan to Iwo Jima, from Iwo to Tokyo, its twin booms traced the shrinking arc of an empire. The same aircraft once dismissed as too complex for combat service now escorted B-29s across entire oceans, photographed cities before they burned, and hunted the remnants of a dying air force. When peace came, the Lightnings stood in long, silent rows, metal exhausted, paint faded, propellers nicked by coral dust. Their pilots, now veterans, understood they had flown not just missions, but a revolution. The Lightning had turned range into doctrine, precision into power, and skepticism into strategy. In 1946, the US Strategic Bombing Survey summed it simply. The P-38 made possible the air war's geometry of reach. It had begun as an idea too ambitious for its time. It ended as the machine that erased time itself. When the war ended, the P-38 faded quietly from the front lines, but never from memory. In 1946, many were melted down for scrap, their aluminum recycled into the peace they had earned. Yet across airfields and archives, the Lightning's influence endured. Its lessons, twin-engine reliability, long-range autonomy, integration of intelligence and air power, became the foundation for every American fighter that followed. Kelly Johnson's next designs at Lockheed, the F-80 Shooting Star, the U-2, the SR-71, each carried the same DNA, radical ideas pursued despite institutional resistance. The Lightning had proven that innovation was not consensus, it was persistence. In Japan, surviving aviators remembered it with reverence and fear. "When we saw the twin tails," one said decades later, "we knew the Americans had mastered the air." The P-38's story was not about a single battle or pilot. It was the story of a nation learning to think in distance, to weaponize precision, to industrialize imagination. Long after its propellers stopped turning, the Lightning's outline remained etched across the Pacific sky, a twin-boomed reminder that the future always begins as something rejected,